The walls were covered with 12 heirloom clocks that ticked in an incoherent, asynchronous rhythm, creating a constant, low-frequency hum of time passing without ever truly arriving. He felt more at home among the dust of the 1930s than in the cold, blue glare of the present. He was a seeker of signals that no longer existed, a man waiting for a broadcast from a world that had long since turned to ash. He was alone, but the machines kept him company. Mark was a man who lived in the wrong century, a shadow moving through a world of digital noise. His attic apartment was a labyrinth of narrow, claustrophobic hallways filled with the ghosts of forgotten machines, broken typewriters, skeletal gramophones, and brass clocks that refused to tell the same time. He believed that objects were more than just wood and metal. He believed they retained the energy of their owners, like static electricity trapped in wool. One freezing November evening, as a biting sleet lashed against the rattling skylights, and the city outside felt like a gray tomb, Mark decided to revive his most mysterious find, a 1930 for Zenith Stratosphere. It was a monumental piece of engineering, nearly 5 feet tall, a cathedral of polished walnut and bird's eye maple that seemed to command the very air in the room. He had discovered it in the pitch-black basement of an abandoned mansion in Massachusetts. Local legends claimed that mansion was thin at the edges, a place where reality bled into something else. The radio had been draped in a thick, oily layer of dust that felt more like gray ash than household grime. The seller had practically begged him to take it, his hands shaking as he lowered the price to a mere pittance, his eyes darting around as if he expected the machine to speak. Mark spent weeks cleaning the 25 massive vacuum tubes inside. When he finally flipped the heavy copper switch, a deep, vibrating hum echoed through the apartment, a sound so low and primal it felt like a vibration. In his very marrow, the scent of heated copper, old ozone, and something inexplicably like rotting kelp and stagnant seawater filled the air. The massive, circular black glass dial slowly glowed with an eerie, pulsing amber light, illuminating Mark's face with the haunting warmth of a dying star. As he turned the heavy bakelite knob, he bypassed the standard stations, the jazz, the static news, the distant weather reports. Then, at the absolute edge of the scale, far beyond the 1,600 kilohertz mark where the numbers had long since faded into white ghosts, he hit a void. There was no static, no white noise. It was a silence so absolute that Mark could hear the rush of blood in his own temples and the frantic, panicked beating of his own heart. Then, from the depths of the 3 massive speakers, a sound emerged that paralyzed him, the rhythmic, slow dripping of water, echoing as if an infinite, lightless ocean lay hidden inside the wooden cabinet. 3981. The voice was female. It was cold, devoid of accent, but it possessed a specific, sharp frequency that induced a sudden, violent nausea. "It's time to wake up, Mark," the voice said, enunciating his name with a terrifying familiarity. Mark dropped his tools, the screwdriver clattering to the floor. The radio was nearly a century old. It had no connection to the modern world, yet the vacuum tubes began to shift their glow, turning from a warm amber to a sickly, bioluminescent sea blue, the exact color of the ocean floor where the sun never reaches. The air in the room grew heavy and cold. The dripping sound became a steady pour, echoing from the very heart of the zenith. "Do you remember 1986, Mark?" the voice asked, now sounding damp, punctuated by the wet, choking sound of someone gasping for air. "Do you remember the gray mist of Cape Cod? The woman in the white coat who stepped into the freezing Atlantic while you, at 10 years old, stood on the sand with clenched fists. You didn't scream. You didn't run for help. You just watched the black waters swallow her, inch by inch, until only the white foam remained. You were the one holding her white silk scarf when the current finally won, pulling her into the abyss." Mark's throat tightened until he couldn't breathe. The memory he had buried under decades of forced forgetting exploded in his mind. He could smell the iodine. He could feel the freezing salt spray on his skin. And he remembered the exact moment the scarf, heavy, Wet and cold had slipped from his trembling, small fingers as he stood paralyzed by the tide. "I found it," the voice whispered, and he realized with a jolt of pure horror that it was his mother's voice, but vibrating through a layer of deep, pressurized water. "The scarf is still wet, Mark. The water in it is still as cold as that November night. Do you want to feel the touch you traded for a lifetime of silence?" Suddenly, the Zenith's walnut casing began to swell and crack. From the speaker grilles, instead of sound, black water began to pour. It was a heavy, viscous liquid that smelled of salt, decay, and the crushing weight of the deep. It filled the apartment at a speed that defied the laws of physics. Mark ran for the door, but the floorboards became soft as quicksand. The water was at his knees, then his waist. In the churning darkness, a long, white silk scarf surfaced, floating like a ghostly jellyfish, coiling tightly around his legs, dragging him down. "We all have our frequency, Mark. Yours is for 112. The next morning, when the authorities broke down the door, they found the apartment bone dry. There was no water damage, no smell of the sea. But inside the Zenith, they found a forest of fresh, green seaweed, living deep-sea shells, and a white silk scarf so saturated with salt water that it continued to drip for months, creating a dark, permanent stain on the floor. Mark was never seen again. The detectives assigned to the case found even more disturbing clues. In Mark's desk sat an old audio cassette box. Inside, instead of magnetic tape, was long, gray human hair, braided and soaked in brine. They also recovered a Polaroid taken on that beach in 1986. Every day the photo sat in the evidence locker. It changed. The young Mark began to fade, while a tall, dark figure in the surf grew larger. By the end of the week, the boy was gone, and the figure in the water was reaching out toward the camera lens. 10 years later, retired Detective Elias Thorne entered Evidence Depot number 4. He found the Zenith buried under a tarp that was perpetually damp to the touch. Thorne connected the radio, and the blue glow returned. Elias saw his own life reflected in the glass dial missed opportunities, and his own deathbed filled with sea sand. The radio began to act like a vacuum, sucking the oxygen from the room. With his final ounce of strength, Elias shattered the dial. An implosion followed a scream, like a ship's hull snapping in two. When guards arrived, the Zenith and Elias were gone. The only traces were to wet footprints, and a detective's badge transformed into petrified sea salt. On the wall, etched in corrosive algae, was a new number, 413. The machine was looking for the next witness. If you enjoyed this story, follow for more dark mysteries. Tell us in the comments, what does your radio whisper in the dark?